For more, let's check in with my panel. Behnam Ben Taleblu is a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. He's also with us as Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kampfer, a retired U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer and currently the founder of KIP, which is a strategic risk management firm. Hal, let's start with you. Iran is testing medium-range ballistic missiles believed to be capable of carrying nuclear warheads. What do you make of this?
Well, this is an escalation, and it's certainly, if not a violation of the written UN resolution, and certainly the intent, which was to basically tamp down on their nuclear capability. This missile has tremendous range. Even though it's a medium-range missile, it can hit parts of Europe, pretty much the entire Middle East, possibly multiple independent reentry vehicles, multiple warheads coming in. And if you attach those with a nuclear capability, it's a very potent capability that Iran would have, and within a short period of time could really upset the balance of power in the Middle East.
Behnam, the United Kingdom and France are actually joining the United States in condemning Iran's missile tests. They're saying that this could indeed be a violation of the UN promises. Can the U.S. actually get some European support on sanctioning Iran for this?
Thanks, Michelle. That really is the million-dollar question here. For almost all of the missile tests by Iran since agreeing to the JCPOA nuclear deal back in the summer of 2015, and including flight tests and military operations, and this latest test, that number is 40. The Europeans have cited them to be a problem, but they haven't translated their words into deeds. They haven't gone about actually putting their money where their mouth is and getting sanctions or designations or financial pressure on entities supportive of Iran's missile production, procurement, or proliferation. So the real question is, can the U.S. take this economic leverage generated by the restoration of sanctions and the new evidence of Iran's continued testing and proliferation of missiles and get the Europeans to come on board to a position they already claim to subscribe to?
Behnam, it's not just these ballistic missiles and the testing that Iran is displaying blatant arrogance and violation of previously reached agreements. Iran also has attempted assassinations of Iranian opposition members on European soil, in France and in Denmark. Do you think that Europe then may be finally coming around, that it can now be persuaded to see Iran's broader behavior is so dangerous that their support for the nuclear deal can no longer be justified?
In some ways, I do hope that, the tweets and statements that we saw over the weekend since the Iranian medium-range ballistic missile test could be the green shoots of a more comprehensive Iran policy, so that they can dispense with the fiction that Iran is actually not in contravention of the UN Security Council resolution codifying the deal. We can only hope, but in the interim, the U.S. really needs to press the case, and fortunately, the evidence is there for it.
Hal, Iran also beefing up its naval forces. It's added a brand new domestically made stealth destroyer to its fleet, at least that's according to Iran. It says that it's sending it straight to the Strait of Hormuz, which, as we know, Iran has threatened to shut down in the past, and it's a very strategic waterway because 30% of the world's oil supply passes through the Straits of Hormuz. Do you see this as any kind of real challenge to the U.S. Navy?
Michelle, it's a challenge. They're calling it a stealth destroyer. It looks kind of like our Arleigh Burke class, which has been around for quite some time. I don't know exactly how much stealth characteristics that destroyer has, but it is very provocative. That is such a tight waterway. The Straits of Hormuz, there's just not a lot of maneuver room in there. So any additional naval assets in there causes a big shift in terms of what everyone's able to do. With that said, I think we're able to handle this. We're just, it's not good to have it there. And then when you add in with everything else they've been doing that's provocative, like the cyber army and things like that, there are a lot of provocative actions simply across the board, not just naval, not just missiles, but a lot of other.
And do you get the sense then, Hal, when you look at this new stealth destroyer, the ballistic missile testing, reports that Iranian-trained Syrian troops have been mobilized on the border with Israel, Hal, do you get the sense that Iran is gearing up for something?
Well, it certainly has that feel. They're pushing on all fronts. The actions that we talked about in Europe, Iranian trained troops on the border with Israel, missiles, Navy, cyber, basically boasting of a cyber capability, cyber warfare capability. The 747 with whatever cargo that just landed in Beirut, which is obviously going to go to Hezbollah. All of this just seems to be adding more and more pressure that something has to be done to turn this back. And I think that's why, Benjamin Netanyahu went up to Brussels so quickly to meet with Secretary Pompeo, was to address these issues because there is a real sense of urgency.
And Behnam, to that point of Pompeo meeting with the Prime Minister in Brussels, Pompeo saying that Iran's missile testing and its missile proliferation is growing, and quote, that there is a risk of escalation in the region if we fail to restore deterrence. Fail to restore deterrence. How do you think this deterrence could be destroyed? Is it diplomatically or some kind of military action?
Well, a lot of it actually could be signaling. The U.S. has restored the major economic penalties that were waived by the nuclear deal, but now it's time to move beyond economic sanctions and look at what can we do to increase our partners' capabilities. The Gulf states have ballistic missile defense, but they're not integrated. That's one thing we could look to help support, help bring a responsible end to the war in Yemen so Iran doesn't have a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula. There was just reports last week that the Saudis are going to get THAAD. It's a new ballistic missile defense system, making sure our partners have the capability to defend themselves and make sure that the authorities are there on the books to interdict Iranian deliveries, as well as the political cooperation is there with our allies to share information, to tighten export controls, and to thwart Iran's procurement or production efforts.
Hal, very quickly, do you see the U.S. potentially teaming up with Israel in some kind of preemptive military move?
I wouldn't rule it out. I think we're going to be very cautious if we go that direction. The possibilities of this thing escalating far beyond whatever immediate goals or objectives that sort of preemptive attack would have are considerable, and it goes across the region. And what starts possibly in Syria or someplace else could quickly go down to the Straits of Hormuz. And even though eventually we would end up winning whatever naval confrontation would happen down there, there would be a huge interruption in all the seagoing commerce going through the straits, and it would take a while to recover from that.
Behnam, are you getting an indication that the sanctions have had any kind of impact so far, at least in terms of curbing Tehran's financial capabilities to be disruptive in the region?
Well, definitely there's been some major damage done to Iran's banking system. Of course, the false multiplier for U.S. sanctions is the poor state of the Iranian economy and mismanagement and corruption, which is rampant at home. But I think what the administration needs to be cautious of is to make sure that Iran's inflation rate doesn't decrease, that Iran doesn't have secret reserves of foreign exchange, that Iran doesn't exploit the humanitarian loopholes that exist for the countries that have received exemptions to purchase Iranian oil. So the U.S. is going to have to police its sanctions, because when you do levy sanctions, it's not just one and done. It's about enforcement, and that means staying in the game politically, not just economically. So that real answer will be found out in Q1 or 2 of 2019.
Behnam, there was this calculation that perhaps the sanctions would help foment more unrest from the people in Iran that could potentially lead to some kind of a coup and a takeover against the mullahs in Tehran. Any indication that that could be happening or starting to happen?
Well, there are still small-scale labor protests that continue on Iran. We know Iran's Arab-heavy province, Khuzestan, has been experiencing protests for several days now. We know that there are actual protests in response to political prisoners, which are held in the country. So in many ways, Iran remains a tinderbox. It has all the elements of popular discontent against strong central authority. The question for Iran is not if, it's always been when. Unfortunately, the regime has been a master at cracking down on various forms of protest before and can meet different kind of groups with different kind of forces. But right now, I think the goal of the U.S. remains behavior change, and they're looking to change the Iranian regime's export of the revolution abroad, as evidenced by missile testing and the weaponry that Brian Hook presented.
Right. Well, so far, these sanctions against Iranian oil exports have been handled very well, many would say, in the sense that they haven't caused a major spike in oil prices so far with those exemptions, which, of course, would benefit Iran in the long run if oil prices spiked. Thank you so much, Behnam Ben Taleblu. Good to have you with us. Hal Camphor, always a pleasure. Appreciate your analysis today, as always.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right.